I'm standing in a suburban street in southwest London, or at least that side of the street is in London. That side of the street is in the county of Surrey, outside London. The outer boundary of London divides one side of this street from the other. That has all sorts of consequences for the residents on both sides. Residents on the Surrey side pay about 10% more in property taxes than those on the London side. Older people living on the London side get to travel free on underground trains, while those living on the Surrey side don't. And if you call an ambulance to an address on one side of the street, a different ambulance service responds than would respond on the other side. Apart from all those practical differences, the fact that the London boundary divides this neighbourhood in half is important when it comes to showing data about areas on maps. We often show data for areas on a type of map called a choropleth map, where each area for which we have data is represented by a polygon, and the colour of the polygon shows a value from the data. So, for example, on this map, darker shades represent higher levels of health inequality, and lighter shades represent lower levels. Lots of statistical data is published for geographic areas rather than for individual addresses or streets. So if you want to know about poverty in this area, or health, or any number of other things, you'll be able to find data for different areas that contain this street, but you typically won't find data for the street itself. That's because some streets have only a few houses on them, so publishing data at address or street level would risk breaching the privacy of the people who live here. Agencies that publish data about places have to choose which areas they publish data for. For example, the government publishes estimates of poverty in each local government ward, then also aggregates that data into estimates of poverty at local authority level, and at regional level, and at national level. Publishing data for administrative areas like wards, boroughs and regions is useful for lots of reasons. For example, it could help a local councillor understand problems their own ward might face. But one issue with administrative areas is that their boundaries tend to change every few years to reflect changes in population. That makes it difficult to answer questions about how things like poverty have changed over time. To get around this problem, governments tend to also publish data for a set of statistical areas that change much less often. Like the administrative areas, there are typically several nested levels of statistical area. In England, for example, statistical data is published for small areas called output areas, which are then grouped into progressively larger areas, with datasets being published for areas at each level. Statistical data for local areas can tell us a lot about these places. But there is one problem we need to be aware of. This is called the ecological fallacy. The problem here is that when we look at maps that show data for different areas, our brains tend to assume that the data shown for a particular area applies equally to every street, house or person in that area. Equally, when there's a difference between two areas on a map, we tend to assume that the difference happens at the boundary between those areas. This is a problem because, in fact, it's quite likely that places just one side of the boundary, or the other, tend to be pretty similar to each other, despite looking quite different on a choropleth map. So whenever we look at a map that shows data for areas, we need to remember that the data only represents a summary of each area as a whole, rather than telling us something about any particular street or place within that area. Because of the ecological fallacy, we generally avoid using choropleth maps to show data that we could show in a more detailed way. For example, it's almost always better to show hotspots of crime using a density map rather than a choropleth map. But sometimes we have little choice but to use a choropleth map because data is only available for areas, not in individual locations. So in summary, lots of useful data is published for areas rather than individual streets or addresses. Governments typically publish data for both administrative and statistical areas, and whenever we use a choropleth map, we need to consider the ecological fallacy.